Inspired by works like Lord of the Rings and Berserk, as well as tabletop RPGs and their early computer counterparts, Fire Emblem inherits swaths of tropes from its predecessors: wise old sages, lone swordsmen, riven riders, and so on. Fire Emblem likewise adopts a narrative focused on the lords and ladies of the respective houses and kingdoms, typical of the medieval fantasy setting. There is no such thing as a Fire Emblem game without a protagonist born into nobility, or one whose goal is tied to them. To put it bluntly, I find this dreadfully dull. After a certain point, seeing the same story play out on repeat across well over a dozen games bores me. It isn't as though these games are a chore, but their narratives fail to entice, especially on repeat playthroughs. It may be fantasy, but I still prefer conflicts I have a personal interest in. I'm a working class person, and in medieval times, I would have certainly been a serf. I don't care for the ruling class today, and I would not have liked them then either. A work that wants me to invest into a narrative that I am not inherently drawn to is fighting an uphill battle, and it's one it scarcely wins. I find Vision Quest, the ROM hack, is a great example of the inverse of this. Because it remains critical of the nobility for its entire runtime through Storch and Walio's perspective, it subverts the usual Fire Emblem narrative structure, which creates a narrative that grips me through its entire lengthy 4 acts, while shorter Fire Emblem games put me to sleep. The Tellius games come close to achieving the same, as Path of Radiance focuses on the sympathy of Valencia losing her family and home as an equally important part of her struggle as losing her throne. Radiant Dawn gets even closer, yet it drops the ball at the final stretch by committing hard to the notion of the royalty being the most important people come Part 4, both in story and in gameplay. It's irritating for a game to have a final act that feels like a collaborative effort from all of your units in a playthrough, just for them all to be overshadowed by the royalty that the game plops in your lap. It becomes even more egregious with the epilogue. Radiant Dawn is my favorite game in the series by a significant margin, and that is in no small part to the fact that it is chock full of critiques of authority. Thus, it feels like a slap in the face for a game this committed to critiquing the state and its role in manufacturing consent for racism and other forms of abuse, to turn around and say that now that all the bad guys are dead, the good guys can go back to ruling their countries without a word. Did we not just cover, with Micaiah, Laron, Peleus, and Nasala, how it does not matter who has power because that power inexorably leads to violence and abuse? I have to agree with Ike here. If I just took down God and a bunch of senators in the name of universal liberation, just to watch my friends and comrades reinforce the same states that built the shackles we just shed, I would also leave them and never turn back. Another letdown in this regard is Shadows of Valentia, which spends a substantial amount of its runtime flip-flopping between whether no one is more deserving of power than anyone else, or if Alm is a special good boy because he was born under Leo Sun and Sagittarius Moon. Thracia 776 actually turns the tide on this and asks Leaf to earn his leadership position. It feels better to have the prince on the throne when we see that he has tried, failed, learned, carried on, and succeeded until he has, in some way, earned his position, like Ike has to grow into leading the Grell mercenaries, and Elincia has to grow into being the Queen of Crimea. However, I still find that these fall short. At the end of the day, even when these characters are shown to grow into the leadership role, the hereditary system still offers them a chance that no one else is granted. But this is a conclusion that Fire Emblem resists. Sure, it makes for a nice arc for the hero to be proven just and right, and for them to be conferred rulership for it. But does it not make a character more heroic to turn to their friends, their comrades, the common people, and to say that they are no more deserving to rule than anyone? If you allow a bit of a tangent, let's take a closer look at Alm in Shadows of Valentia. One of the biggest disappointments in the series came in one particular scene in Act 5. After they've learned of the death of Milla to be the reason for the famine in Zofia, and with the knowledge that the death of Duma will result in the same fate for Rigel, Alm nevertheless resolves to defeat Duma to free the world from his domination. So far, this is good stuff. When I played this game for the first time, I had experienced with most of the Fire Emblem games and knew how the plot of Gaiden went. I went in as blind as I could despite that, not knowing where the story would go and if it differed from Gaiden in any substantial ways. So, I got to this cutscene and had to pick my jaw up off the ground when Lucas, Claire, and Alm talked about setting aside their nobility to till the earth with the common people. I could not believe my eyes as I witnessed, for the first time in a Fire Emblem game, the characters throw away the nobility they were born into in an acknowledgement of the common class struggle. I proceeded to then learn that I should never believe my eyes because the game proceeds to backtrack on everything it says here, with Alm becoming the supreme emperor of an entire continent because he is such an extra special boy. This results in a game with unsatisfying themes that feels like it's backtracking on itself. However, as Professor Bopper says in this video of his, the game is not really backtracking. None of this is inconsistent. The player's interpretation of the themes of Shadows of Valentia must contend with the twist of Alm's nobility. Alm does not set aside his seat and return to farming with his friends, acknowledging them as his equal. He reclaims the throne of Valentia as is his divinely ordained and fatherly designed birthright. What is this but a ballad celebrating the divine right of kings? Much like one who is watching their crown crumble before them, Fire Emblem has been holding onto the nobility with a death grip. But what if I told you that this is but one facet of a many-headed beast deeper than Fire Emblem? And what if there was but one game that laid everything bare? There is no better place to start with Genealogy of the Holy War than its name. As that title suggests, Fire Emblem 4 tells a story of a history of divine warriors, the Crusaders, whose lineage has been passed down through their holy blood, sacred artifacts, and noble houses. Over a century after the time of the original Crusaders, the world is torn asunder by a shadowy cult, manipulating the world's governments from behind the scenes in an attempt to undermine the world the Crusaders created. After the heroes of the first generation have been defeated, and the dark cult gains control of the world, they begin sacrificing children to begin reviving their dark god Loptous. Meanwhile, the descendants of the fallen heroes, likewise blessed by their divine right, come together to form a resistance. Through their bold efforts and their holy blessings, the evil cult and their world government fall, allowing the heroes to restore their divinely ordained kingdoms to right. For completely unrelated reasons, blood libel is a term that refers to the anti-Semitic notion that Jewish people murder Christians, particularly Christian children, for their blood, a lie which has been used to inspire anti-Jewish hate as far back as the 1100s. A common trope with blood libel is that the reason Jewish people allegedly sacrifice Christians is to bring into the world Satan, or the Antichrist, or both. Another unrelated point is that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a work of black propaganda that falsely alleges to be a transcript of the world's Jewish leaders discussing their plans to enact world domination. Despite the many ideological consistencies and chronological incongruencies proving the document to be a complete farce, the work would nonetheless inspire anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, pogroms, and genocide. The Protocols outlines 24 protocols of the alleged international Jewish conspiracy. Let's take a look at them, shall we? Protocol 2 states that a supposed plot by Jewish people aims to form an international government to subjugate the world, in particular the Western world. The protocol makes use of the myth of social Darwinism, alleging that Jewish world leaders intend to conquer white people. This would be used by people like Adolf Hitler, who would use the lie to justify social Darwinism for their own means against Jewish people, who said they must be destroyed before the illusory threat destroys them. In Fire Emblem 4, the Lopterian cult forms an international order through conquering Grand Vale, transforming it into the Lopterian Empire, and making vassals of its neighbors. This then justifies the player's actions as they build their own army, eventually toppling the Lopterian Empire. Wow, that doesn't look very good. But surely that must be a fluke, right? 3 and 5 state that the aristocracy, whose downfall was allegedly orchestrated by Jewish people, were benefactors of the people and the shield that stood between the masses and the alleged threat of Jewish domination. The most iconic moment in Fire Emblem 4, memed to death by the community at this point, is the Battle of Belhala, during which everyone in the player's army, many of whom, including Sigurd, are nobles, are killed or turned to stone by Arvis and his forces. Though he stands to gain from this, he is not the puppet master. Arvis, of course, has been little more than a pawn in Manfroy's game this entire time. Alright, enough of this. I don't have to be coy to make a point when the comparison speaks for itself. We can look well beyond the Battle of Belhala to the epilogue, wherein the heirs of the noble houses get restored to right in the name of justice and prosperity. Protocol 4 states that a world order that follows the word of God and respects the brothership of man is what stands in the way of the conspiracy. In Generation 1, the plot by the Lopter Church results in the untimely deaths of Sigurd, Quan, and Eldigan, long-standing friends whose deaths represent the fall of these countries, and with them, the world. It is thanks to the efforts of their children, embodying the spirit of their fathers and the holy crusaders from whom they are descended, that the world is returned to order. Protocols 7 and 9 go into how the downfall of Western civilization will come from infighting within Europe, allegedly orchestrated in secret by Zionists. In particular, one chief argument stated is that should one government rebel against the international force, then the force will spark war with its neighbors, and if those neighbors too rebel, then a worldwide war will be started to maintain the alleged Jewish international government. The plot of Generation 1 sees a series of conflicts. Verdane versus Grandvale, then Augustria versus Grandvale, internal politics between Grandvalian nobles, civil war in Silesia, and then the boiling over of the Cold War in the Thracian Peninsula. Behind each of these conflicts, across every corner of Yggdrasil, is the Loptous Church. Protocols 8 and 11 detail the core strategy of establishing widespread control by the alleged conspiracy. Fill the world's governments with Jewish people where possible, and with well-trusted Gentiles elsewhere. Watched by members of the conspiracy, of course, that is, until they can be replaced by one of their own conspirators. This is also the strategy of the Loptous cult, with members like Sandima, Veld, and often Manfroy himself pulling the strings. Assisted by their loyal co-conspirators like Arvis, Chagall, and Raedric, Lopturian control over the continent of Yggdrasil quickly seeped through the cracks. Protocol 15, as well as Protocol 11, illustrates the way by which the supposed Jewish government will maintain control. Brutal killings and exile of all political opponents. The goal is not only to put down challenge to their control, but to instill such fear into the populace that ensures they will not even try to resist. Looking back at the Battle of Belhala, we can see how the Loptous Church and its allies operate. Total slaughter with little quarter given, save for those turned to stone or the terrible fate that befalls Tailchew. Though a handful of Sigurd's allies escaped, a life on the run in the far reaches of Yggdrasil, constantly looking over one's shoulder, was terror in its own right. Fear is one of the most potent weapons wielded by the Loptous Church. Through their overwhelming power and influence, the denizens of Yggdrasil are forced to watch as their children are snatched from their homes and many men conscripted to serve the Empire. Dalsin, Hicks, and Hannibal are just a few examples, but this practice took place across the entire continent. The threat of violence was just as potent as the violence itself in establishing and maintaining control. Finally, Protocol 24 outlines how the dynasty and its heads will rule the world. The head of the dynasty and ruler of the world will be a carefully selected and controlled figurehead of the greater force who ensure, through strict control from birth, that each head of the dynasty is sufficiently loyal and fit to rule. Arvis may be the ruler of Grandvale, but he is nonetheless at the hands of Manfroy and the Loptous Church. They blackmail him into sleeping with Deirdre and producing a child, Julius, who has the major Loptos blood, and is thus fit to be a host for the unholy dragon. Though Arvis is the ruler for now, his son is the one the Loptous Church anticipates truly ruling the world when the rebirth of the Lopturian Empire is complete. And, in the 17 years since Generation 1 and 2, the Loptous Church does just that, raising Julius with the word of Loptos, ensuring he becomes the maniacal zealot we see in the game. Additionally, one element that pervades the protocols is the characterization of Jewish leaders as extremely arrogant, which arises from the anti-Semitic perspective of the idea of Jewish people as God's chosen people. From the point of view of the anti-Semite, who believes groups of people to be better than others and more deserving of humanity than others, the idea of Jewish people seeing themselves as God's chosen people sparks a rabid hatred and fear. The protocols specifically make use of the myth of social Darwinism, alleging that Jewish world leaders intended to conquer white people along those lines. Thus, anti-Semites, projecting their own beliefs about others onto Jewish people, perceive a looming threat, which then, through circular logic, justifies the hatred and eradication of Jews. Indeed, in Fire Emblem 4, it is the Loptous Church's arrogance and feeling of superiority that motivates their conquest of the world. This then allows the narrative to take for granted the righteousness of reconquering the world and eradicating the Lopturians by Seliph and his army. One last quick point about the protocols is how it characterizes the Jewish world leaders as fixated on money and gold. While it should come as little surprise that anti-Semites think Jewish people are greedy, one thing I noticed while researching is that in the original Lopturian Empire before the events of the game, non-Lopturians were subjected to slavery and other terrible conditions unless they could buy their way into the church. It's just some food for thought. If that still doesn't convince you that the Lopturians are based on anti-Semitic beliefs, here's Manfroy using his evil Jewish magic. I think, or at least hope, that at this point we can agree that Fire Emblem 4 genealogy of the Holy War is a little bit steeped in anti-Semitism a lot. But I believe the rot seeps further still. The misogyny in Fire Emblem 4 has already been talked to death, and while the cis heteronormativity hasn't been as much of a focus of debate, it's quite cut and dry. What I find more compelling and more relevant to my points is that Fire Emblem 4 is a fascist founding myth. Now, I should not have to establish the link between fascism and anti-Semitism. The Nazis have already made that abundantly clear, but I think that beyond the anti-Semitism, every beat in Fire Emblem 4 is steeped in the cultural myth of rebirth that fascism builds upon itself, and the core aspects of fascism that define the ideology. Roger Griffin, a political theorist, in his 1991 book, The Nature of Fascism, defined fascism as palingenetic ultranationalism. What this means is that throughout fascist ideology, a central aspect is the belief in the value of the nation above all else, and for the rise of the nation to occur through a process of rebirth, or palingenesis. Fire Emblem 4 is obsessed with nationalism. Almost every member of the cast is an heir of nobility, or the picture of a loyal soldier. For each exception, like Holland, Dew, and Beowulf, to name a few, there are several others who prove FE4's dedication to the concept, and it's not even to mention how every single enemy in the game represents some nation or house, practically. Furthermore, the connections to Rebirth are evident through the game's imagery and themes, and down to the base level consequences of the player's actions as well. Many of the most important steps the player takes in Generation 2 involve recruiting members of the fallen or corrupted houses, and the epilogue sees the player's army heading home to restore their thrones in peace. The game is committed to the synthesis of rebirth and nationalism, which is the essential building block of fascism. In his book, Eternal Fascism, 14 Ways of Looking at a Black Shirt, another political theorist, Umberto Eco, outlines 14 traits that appear throughout fascist movements across the globe. Notably, not all of these traits must exist for something to be fascist. However, combine enough of them in a toxic cocktail and a jilted reactionary, and you have a fascist movement on your hands. At this point, I think it's clear where I'm going with this, and for the sake of time, I will not go into depth on each of the points. Fortunately, I find these far simpler to grapple with. The obsession with a plot, often combined with the aggrandizing of a supposed threat, is one of the most common traits of fascist movements. It easily allows fascist organizers to spur lay people into a fervor and comes with an easy segue to making a scapegoat out of outgroups for the problems in society. If at this point it's not obvious how this relates to Fire Emblem 4, please go back to the beginning of the section and watch it again. The enemy is at the same time too strong and too weak, is doublethink in fascist movements that motivates people to action, while at the same time assuring them that victory is within grasp and they have little to worry if only they pledge their loyalty. Fire Emblem 4 makes use of this strategy primarily through gameplay, actually. We are often shown the totality of the enemy's forces as hordes of enemies matched up against the player's comparatively minuscule army. However, between an AI that often makes puzzling decisions, low enemy quality, and the overwhelmingly powerful tools at the player's disposal, making quick work of the enemies is not much of a hassle. This leads nicely into the point of machismo in fascism, which blends the hero worship and violence of warfare inherent to fascism with sexuality. Umberto says fascist machismo, quote, implies both disdain for women and intolerance and condemnation of non-standard sexual habits. The fact that Fire Emblem 4 has little respect for the women in its cast is a ship that has already sailed. Between the breeding mechanics, which incentivizes every woman to be party to a man, but not every man to a woman, the plot, which features frequent misfortune and downright abuse of women in order to satisfy the arcs of its male characters, and a cast that is genuinely dominated by men, especially when narrowed to the plot-relevant characters, there is little more to get to in that regard. And, as I have previously mentioned, the cis-heteronormativity inherent to many of the game's mechanics further promotes a rigid sexual binary. The term eugenics simulator has been thrown about by the Fire Emblem community to describe a handful of the games, genealogy included, and I find that this touches on a connection to the fascist machismo baked into it. The eugenics-based breeding mechanics incentivize pairing the most optimal and powerful men with the women in order to produce super children who inherit their statistical advantages. This is highlighted by the game's Holy Blood system, which grants units with heritable Holy Blood increased stat growth based on which blood they have, and in some cases, access to unique, all-powerful holy weapons. On top of how this system boils down the cast, in particular the women, to sexual objects tied to their combat performance, the benefactors of the eugenics system are clearly the men. In Generation 2, the most powerful members of the cast are the men, with the women filling support roles, if anything. When making your pairings for Generation 2, the most important factor is typically how the pairing will turn their sons into super soldiers, with the underpowered women left trailing behind. The fixation on holy blood in the lineage of the Crusaders heads into another tenet of fascism, the cult of tradition, which looks to the past for answers to modern problems out of a belief that the esoteric knowledge of the past contains all answers, which can only be turned to and reinterpreted, as opposed to coming up with new solutions. Specifically, Eco notes that cultural syncretism, or the melding of different contradictory beliefs, is not only common, but a nearly essential trait of fascist movements. Both facets of the culture tradition appear throughout Fire Emblem as a whole. One of the unique brands of Fire Emblem's world building is the blending of different folkloric traditions to create a setting that feels distinct, but not specifically placeable in any culture. Likewise, one of the most common plot beats in Fire Emblem involves the main characters receiving a divine blessing in the form of a holy artifact, often with ties to the history in the world and the protagonists themselves, in order to overcome the new dark times in the world. While these plot beats are not inherently fascist, these are elements that piece together cultural myths that fascists often latch onto, and genealogy is a perfect example of this. The syncretism between the Christian, Irish, Norse, and Greco-Roman mythology, which happen to be the most common traditions real-life fascists pull from, play a stronger part in genealogy than any other game in the series. The focus on the Crusader bloodlines and the restoration of the nobility is also an irreplaceable part of genealogy's identity. This sees us return to Griffin's point of palingenetic ultranationalism. The founding myth of fascism is of a society which has been undermined and will be restored, through the fascist movement, to its former glory. With this and the connection to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, we can clearly piece together how FE4's narrative is itself a myth bred from anti-Semitism and fascism. While I cannot resist a character assassination of my favorite punching bag in gaming, it would be foolish to believe the criticism ends here. The points I have made against Fire Emblem 4 apply to several other games in the Fire Emblem series. Divine bloodlines and blessed artifacts, restoration of the nobility, evil cults planning world domination, eugenic breeding systems, and so on. While these things define genealogy, the truth is that Fire Emblem has been tinged with reactionary sentiments from the very first game. I do not believe this makes the entire series irrevocably fascist like FE4. However, the series has latched onto these tropes, and much like reactionaries themselves, refuses to move on. And on top of the point that fascism, anti-Semitism, misogyny, justifications for the nobility and the like are all bad, these tropes in the series create boring storytelling for the 17th time around. Are we, as players, not sorely tired of these same ridiculous tropes? Cloaked interlopers taking over the world, women being mind-controlled, the hero being blessed by some divine dragon to take down a different evil dragon. These tropes might be interesting enough for a few games, but at this point in the series, I am able to guess the general plot structure of a new game without even playing it. I know because I did that with Engage. And though this is tangential to my criticism of the official games, the ROM hacking scene is likewise so attached to these ideas that the narrative of many of these games suffer, despite coming from a community that otherwise rightfully prides itself on learning from the successes and failures of the official releases. Despite this, there are several examples of breakaways from this routine in Fire Emblem. Though Fire Emblem Fates has a reputation for terrible storytelling, I actually quite like how Conquest's final act uses its unique perspective, placing the protagonist among the typical evil empire, to showcase the atrocities of warfare firsthand. I find it refreshing that a Fire Emblem game is willing to reckon with the consequences of the conflicts in the series, even if it only chooses to do so on the route where you side with the cartoon villain. Crimson Flower, in many ways, picks up the mantle from Conquest in its willingness to buck Fire Emblem tradition. Three Houses and Three Hopes have an interest in showing the player the realities of feudalism and the oppressive theocracy that justifies it. This culminates in one of my favorite moments in the series, at the route split between the Crimson Flower and Silver Snow routes. In Chapter 11, when Edelgard stages her revolution, the player is given the opportunity to side with or against Edelgard. Choosing to protect Edelgard causes Rhea, the benevolent guide Byleth has relied upon up to this point, to immediately become aggressive towards them. In truth, aggressive is an understatement. She looks Byleth dead in the face and says, "I shall rip your chest open and take back your heart myself," revealing how much of a threat she has been, which at this point has only been alluded to. But my favorite part of the scene is when Byleth glances over at Edelgard and gives her this absolutely incredible shit-eating grin. And then later, Hubert's got the same grin painted all over his face. However, it's important to realize what makes these moments hit. Finally, you the player, as well as Byleth, have been given the opportunity to make a choice, when until thus far you have been nothing more than an obedient follower of Rhea. Looking at the church and Rhea and making the choice to say, "You are not what is best for Fodlan," is what makes her rage so delicious, and what makes these little expressions absolutely hilarious. It's a moment of agency for a player and a character who has had little of it in the narrative thus far. Likewise, in the context of the series, it feels refreshing to lift the veil and say, I tire of these fairy tale stories. I want to engage with the politics of this world. I want to stand up to the system that has subjected people to monstrous economic conditions, forced marriages, and worse. And I want to take this up with the people who are responsible for it. Yet, I have never felt as galvanized playing Fire Emblem as I have with Radiant Dawn. In Part 4, when all of the fat has been stripped away, the entire world put on pause as almost everyone on Tellius has been turned to stone. Every character the player has ever controlled in this game, which were moments prior clashing steel with each other, simultaneously realize that 1, their true enemy, which they can all agree on, are the senators of Benyon, and 2, there is nothing stopping them from marching right to the Tower of Guidance and putting an end to all this. And then, they join arms and do it. It is the culmination of Radiant Dawn's themes, on how authority manufactures consent for its existence, how it develops systems of marginalization like race and class, and how these systems maintain control and take on a life of their own as they become entwined with the culture itself. A similar moment happens in the end of Vision Quest, no doubt due to its inspiration taken from Radiant Dawn. As they approach Emperor Festin for the final battle, Storch, the main protagonist of the game and a farm boy turned thief turned resistance fighter, confronts Titus, his ally and the ambitious Lord of Bellerot, after he reveals that much of the reason behind the revolution was to seize his own power and become the Emperor himself. This leads to a heated argument between the pair. Titus tries to entice Storch to stay by his side with the luxuries of wealth, but Storch is disgusted at the reality of the ambitions of Titus and declares that he is walking away. This conversation is the pinnacle of Vision Quest themes, highlighting how much the last year of resistance and revolution has changed the people involved. Yet, as Titus learns that Storch has been fighting for little more than the financial security of himself, his family, and his friends, we learn that as much as things have changed, Storch is still the same man he's always been. Be it banditry or revolution, all Storch wants at the end of the day is a warm bed. As we watch Titus's descent from a chivalrous nobleman to the power-hungry emperor typical of the villains, Vision Quest uses the tropes common in Fire Emblem for a compelling narrative hook that holds interest until a satisfying climax at the end. While getting footage for this project, I chose to play Closing Act, a one-chapter long ROM hack by Rivian, which you have been watching this whole time. It focuses on a group of plucky rebels who, in the face of crushing defeat of their uprising, storm Fort Hulong, now occupied by Imperial soldiers, with the aim to destroy as much evidence implicating rebel collaborators. Shen Lei, the only member of the group with anything resembling military discipline, informs the rest of the group that she intends to head back to Fort Hulong, and advises the others to take their chances fleeing now before the Imperials leave the fort in search of them. However, Inspired by Shenlei's resolve in the face of impossible odds, the rest of the rebels take aim at the fort with Shenlei. Some of them believe they may find escape, holding onto the hope of a rowboat left behind that could allow them to flee. Others merely seek the grace of a meaningful death. Through its brief 1-hour playtime, Closing Act provides us a snapshot of the lives of those unfortunate enough to be born under horrible circumstances. However, instead of a dour gloom, Closing Act invites us to be inspired. Through brief glimpses into a handful of characters, Closing Act shows how a number of people, despite their differences, can unite in the face of utterly grim circumstances. Much like how the rebellion began due to farmers being unable to grow enough food, the situation, after the fall of Fort Hulong and the rebellion with it, guides them towards resistance in the face of brutal subjugation. Closing Act says that the fatalistic perspective of the inevitability of our demise at the hands of authority can be resisted, as pacification chains us down to our downfall as much as any soldier might. It does not say that fighting valiantly will lead to your survival. It acknowledges that these platitudes are the chains. The future is simply unknowable. All that we can do is act. A text that heavily guides my analysis of Closing Act is Blessed is the Flame by Serafinsky, an introduction to anarcho-nihilism. Serafinsky says in the final section, "The void. From the shattered tools and bones of our predecessors, we craft our own weapons. Nothing is guaranteed to work, yet we attack regardless." I can think of no better passage to exemplify the meaning behind the boldness, courage, and resolve that the rebels show in their bid to retake Fort Hulong and save as many people as they can. Closing Act shows how much less can be more in its brief interactions, which eclipse several whole Fire Emblem games with the wealth of meaning and emotion within each character, culminating in a final set of scenes that left me shattered. I cried when I finished the game and saw the final scenes for the first time. I cried again as I reviewed my footage. I almost cried again writing this segment. I refuse to spoil this segment. Closing Act is an hour long and it's free. I implore you to experience it for yourself. It seems trivial to mention in the face of everything covered thus far, but the deviations from Fire Emblem's gameplay conventions in Closing Act are an essential part of the work. Closing Act allows all player units to move the remainder of their unspent tiles after taking most actions, including combat. This pairs nicely with the relative weakness of the player's forces, as hit-and-run tactics, typical of guerrilla forces, form the bread and butter of your strategic approach. Closing Act also grants a handful of items and weapons with unique effects, like a low-damage acid flask which nullifies the defense of the target for a single turn. This mitigates the defense of the armored enemies, which allows your characters, who may not even be able to take them down if they all ganged up on them, to defeat them with ease. The player has other tools, like temporary stat boosters and set damage AoE attacks, which are not available to the enemy. However, the Imperial Force, which not only outnumber the rebels, brings several of their own unique tools. As well as what I have mentioned of the player, 1-2 range crossbows that nullify defenses, and smoke signals which bring in reinforcements on the enemy's side, are just a handful of the asymmetrical capabilities at play. This builds a ludonarrative resonance that brings each component of the game together, resulting in a brilliant game which surpasses the sum of its parts. Nevertheless, Closing Act's unique mechanics are designed in such a way that retains the identity of Fire Emblem. Player phase, enemy phase, stats, combat, promotion, these all work exactly the same way as they do in vanilla, retaining that splendid core gameplay loop which has had me in its palm of its hand for years. Likewise, the narrative is not dissimilar from what several Fire Emblem games have already tried. If not created for the Marth challenge, Closing Act's single chapter could have easily been a side story in a work detailing the grander conflict that is only otherwise left to the background. Chapters like 5x of Sacred Stones show how a short mid-quel chapter can slot into an existing narrative to enrich the experience. The many strengths of Closing Act, as well as the moments in games previously mentioned, teach us that Fire Emblem games can subvert and dispose of the usual Fire Emblem tropes to create moments that stick with the player without losing the recognizability of Fire Emblem. I believe this not only makes them great, but blazes a trail for ensuing games to follow. I love Fire Emblem. I have been playing the games for 12 years now, and I would not have even bothered to make this video if not for a wellspring of love for the series within me. However, my love does not come with blindness. These games have been a constant for over half of my conscious lifespan now, and as I have grown well into my adulthood, I look back and wonder, When will Fire Emblem grow up with me? Perhaps it's that these games are primarily developed for teenagers, but Fire Emblem feels stunted in its growth. For each step forward, like Radiant Dawn and Crimson Flower, we see steps taken back. Not that I think that the games should lose sight of their foundation, but I want to see these games blossom into what we get glimpses of, and at least in my opinion, what they want to be. Fire Emblem is truly a remarkable series, withstanding heavy experimentation with the core gameplay loop and narrative structure intact, which coalesce into a robust, recognizable identity over 35 years, indicates the strength of these games, both as pastimes and works of art. It may be that Fire Emblem will stay steady on its path. I don't work at Intelligent Systems. As unfortunate as it is, I have no say in what will become of the series. What I can do, however, is choose to have faith in the future of Fire Emblem, as I reflect on the road taken. I just want to give a huge thank you to my friend Queegis, as well as all of my friends really, as well as my amazing partners. It wouldn't be possible without any of them, not just for help with the editing and the video making process, but just the motivation is the biggest thing that anybody could have given to me. I'd also just like to say, if you made it this far in the video, you could like, comment, subscribe. I know I've never made a video before, but I've, know how YouTube works. I'm not just engagement baiting. I'm genuinely looking for feedback on this video. This is the first video editing project I've ever done besides just cutting things down. And I just would like to know, what people would be interested in and what I could do to improve my videos going forward, because I do have a lot more projects that I've already started working on. On top of that, I also have a mind to pick up streaming. Furthermore, in the description, I'll include links and sources for the music and the books that I've referenced. Definitely worth checking out if you found the subject of this video at all interesting. And just huge thank you that you would even finish watching this video, honestly, that anybody would do that. I am just very grateful for that. Seriously, just thank you.